Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Chirurgy, also known as Byron Sidious. Today, I'll be presenting for your entertainment a new Amelia City story. What happened to Straub Avenue? Part 1. Martin carried his Voltron figure about the house, making his way down the hallway from his room with the barest touch of 2 fingers, attempting to envision the giant robot in flight through space as he made strange wheeshing noises to accompany the movement. Much like legions of other 7- and 8-year-old boys across the country in 1987, he had become entranced with the imported animated show. And just a couple of months prior, he had opened the hulking plastic and metal monstrosity from its packaging with wild abandon on Christmas morning, his heart pounding with excitement, mind aflame with imaginative possibilities of how he and his brother Jacob could now create their own play scenarios with their collective Transformers and GoBots figures, involving the giant robo who would, quote, form blazing sword to vanquish various alien threats against the Earth. Passing from the thicker carpeting of the hallway into the living room, Martin quickly swept the room visually, spotting his father seated as usual in his armchair, a plush piece with mud-brown upholstering, a picture of a winter-bound barn of some sort on the back and seat cushions. The lamp table to his left hosted his usual cup of coffee in small, square black ashtray, a smoldering cigarette resting butt out in one of the corner notches as the Simmons family patriarch read his morning newspaper. The presence of Dad, of course, meant that Martin reflexively adjusted his volume to barely a whisper, to avoid irking Dad with his Saturday morning play. On weekdays, Dad didn't seem to mind quite so much, since he'd already by now be on his 2nd or 3rd cup of coffee and be getting ready to head to work for the day, almost glad for the noise his sons produced to help him wake up to face the day. Weekends, however, were sacred to all members of the Simmons family, and a certain level of peace and quiet was expected until around 10 a.m. At that point, all bets were basically off. Passing along the back wall of the living room, behind the couch and around the corner, keeping Dad in his peripheral for a few moments, left shoulder brushing against the brutally ugly floral pinstripe wallpaper that Mom had insisted on using in the living room, hallway, and his parents' bedroom, as well as the laundry room. Martin often wondered about the laundry room, given that only half of it was covered in the paper. He hadn't yet come to fully grip Mom's rationale for using it in there, though she often said things like, waste not, want not, and similar quips to explain some of her decisions. Flying his Voltron toward the smell of food wafting from the kitchen, Martin soon found himself stepping onto linoleum flooring that was still chilled from the house's side door having recently been opened for several seconds. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, waggling a couple of Transformers at one another while whispering to himself, his back to his mother, Mom at the stovetop, shuffling eggs around in a large skillet. She looked over at Martin and smiled at him, eyes alight. "Good morning, sweetie. Have a seat. Breakfast's almost ready." Martin did so happily, hopping up on the chair to his brother's right, standing Voltron on the table. "Boys, robots off the table, please," Mom said without turning her head to regard them. As she divvied eggs, bacon, buttered English muffins, and sausage links onto several plates, she tilted her head slightly back and bellowed out, "Randy! Breakfast!" Martin and Jacob shared a quick, knowing look of concern. A fully cooked breakfast on a Saturday morning wasn't uncommon in the Simmons household, but Mom using Dad's real name to summon him to come sit and join her and the boys wasn't the norm. Typically, she would call out honey or sweetie, or, after an evening wherein the Simmons boys heard the peculiarly happy grunts and muffled noises coming from down the hall from their parents' bedroom, Mom would sometimes affectionately call Dad Babe, a shift of lexicon they didn't quite comprehend, though Martin was starting to have a kind of formless, wordless understanding that something was different about Mom on those follow-up mornings, and Dad too. It was as though they were both teeming with an unspoken happiness, brought on by things that they couldn't quite explain to their sons yet. Someday, I'll get it, Martin thought on those mornings. For the moment, however, apprehension brushed the nape of his neck. Mom only used Dad's real name like this when there was something serious to be discussed, or some final decision had been arrived at, one with which she would brook no argument. The last time she'd done it was on Christmas Eve, when she had insisted that, in order to mollify her parents, the family would all join Grandma and Grandpa for Christmas Eve Mass down at St. Luke's, a 3-hour chunk of Martin's life that the boy would love to have back in his life-lived account, if such a thing existed. As his father took up his usual seat at the head of the table, sniffling slightly and nodding his unspoken thanks to Mom for handing him a refreshed mug of coffee, Martin focused on Dad's eyes. They had the shadowed, sunken look of fatigue or unhappiness he had come to recognize in his short life. "Martin, Jacob, we need to have a short talk," Dad began, pausing just long enough to take a sip of coffee. "You boys notice we have the living room curtains drawn shut?" The Simmons boys both nodded, offering no spoken response. That wasn't how these conversations went. "There's good reason for that. We don't want to be peepers in this house, butting our noses in where they don't belong. Until your mother or I say so, you boys are to stay inside today and not go looking outside." Jacob, being a little younger and unable to control his curiosity any better than a bird spotting a shiny object, yipped out, "What's going on outside?" There was a brief glance shared between Mom and Dad before Dad responded. "We don't know exactly what happened, but there's some police around the Hollins' place, over there on Straub." Straub Avenue was a stout street ending in a cul-de-sac, situated across the way from the Simmons home. If one looked out the living room window, they would be able to look straight down the center of Straub Avenue. The Holland family lived in the first house on the right when looking that way, a nice little 2-story with dark red vinyl siding. Martin and Jacob didn't know the family very well, the 3 children all being in their teen years and the mother seeming to never leave the house, except to go on errand runs. All they really knew about them was that the Hollands had lived there as long as they had been alive. It was now Martin's turn to be incapable of holding back his curiosity. "Did something happen to them?" he asked, while Mom pointed at his plate to indicate that he should be using his mouth to eat instead of posing questions. "We don't know," Dad said evenly. He took a bite of his bacon, chewed thoughtfully. "But I don't doubt that you boys will hear something about it when you get to school on Monday. Whatever you hear, just ignore it. Rumors are not facts, and it's rude to indulge in them." "Your father's right," Mom chimed in, casting a glance toward the living room. "Now eat your breakfast, then go get your teeth brushed and get dressed for the day." Martin and Jacob set to eating without further probing, instead using the opportunity to ask if they could watch cartoons once they were dressed in the living room. Mom and Dad gave the okay, and the Simmons boys quickly wolfed down their food and dashed away, robot toys in hand. Randy let out a long sigh, struck up a cigarette, and sauntered out to the living room with his wife, twitching the curtain over the window aside to take another look down at the Hollands' house. "Still there?" "Ambulances are gone," Randy said, watching as a pair of plain-clothes detectives came ambling out of the house's front door, uniformed patrolmen out by the street in a cluster, chattering to one another. One of the detectives made a few motions and said something perfunctory to the uniforms, who broke ranks and started putting yellow crime scene tape around the front door and the walkway leading from the sidewalk up to the house proper. With no fencing around the property, they had to retrieve a set of metal stakes from the trunk of a cruiser in order to create a cordon, blocking public access to the house. By the time the boys were finished watching an episode of Voltron, Randy was able to pull the curtains aside, letting natural March sunshine into the house. Randy set the case of Pepsi on the counter, pointing back past the cashier. "Let me grab a carton of Marlboro Lights, King's hardpack," he said with a sigh. The cashier grabbed one, punching the assigned buttons on his register to bring up Randy's total. "Hey, you hear about what happened over on Straub Avenue last night?" the young man behind the counter asked, a part-time worker who Randy suspected was still in his last couple of years of high school. He narrowed his eyes at the kid, shook his head slightly. "So it begins," he thought. "I heard the mom and dad were some kind of devil worshippers and they gutted their kids for some kind of human sacrifice ritual. Friggin' gnarly stuff, man," the kid said, shaking his head and making Randy's change for him. "Let me ask you something, son," Randy replied, trying to control his tone. The kid tilted his head slightly, listening. "You ever want to do something other than working here when you graduate?" "Well, yeah. I want to work on TV, doing sound stuff." "Okay. It takes a certain amount of work and a certain amount of brains, yeah?" "Yeah." "So don't go rotting your brain with bullshit stories like that, kid," Randy Simmons said sardonically, taking his change, his soda, and his smokes, and heading for the gas station door. When he got out to the station wagon, clambering down into it, he took a moment to consider that maybe he'd been a little too harsh with the young man. Too late now to make up for it, he started the car and headed for home. As he came to one of the last intersections before the house, he took a moment to regard the blaring red stop sign on the corner of Lake and Barker Streets. Someone had spray-painted some kind of graffito on it, a sigil that made him think of what the kid at the gas station had said. The image was of 4 hooked blue claws, joined along their rounded tops by a thick black horizontal line. Randy shook his head and muttered to himself, "Why do idiots from the city have to drag their weirdness out here to the suburbs?" Life in North Perry was supposed to be quieter than in the nearby Amelia city. Part 2. Freedom! Sweet, sweet summer freedom had finally arrived, and Martin and Jacob had no intentions of wasting even a minute of it. Nor, from all the hullabaloo and raucous noise and activity around them on the bus, did any of their neighborhood friends and classmates. As the first few kids stormed their way off the bus at the first stop along the route, Peter Jensen popped his head up over the back of the seat in front of the Simmons boys, toothily beaming down at them. "You guys want to come over tomorrow and play some football?" he asked. "Did you finally get a new one?" Martin replied. "Yeah, I snagged one from the gym's equipment room while everybody was cleaning out their lockers yesterday," Peter said with a snicker. Jacob pulled a face, shaking his head. "You could get in big trouble for that, Pete," Jacob whined, looking around as if he had been part of some international crime ring, and someone would surely be eavesdropping upon them. The other boy chuckled and waved a hand at Jacob to dismiss his concerns. "Nobody's going to care, trust me," Peter replied, disappearing back beyond the dense green bus seat. A few minutes later, the bus came to an abrupt halt after turning onto Lake, the driver shifting into park and engaging the air brakes. He got up out of his seat and looked back at the kids who were his momentary charges, and seemed to puff himself up with a deep breath. Martin quirked an eyebrow, curious. "Everybody stay here, stay in your seats, and nobody even think about getting off this bus until I get back," the driver intoned with all the authority he could muster. Martin had never thought much about his bus driver, a normally quiet, unassuming and average-looking man in his middle years, who rarely spoke above a whisper to any of the kids on his vehicle. When he opened the door and stepped down off the bus, Martin slid slowly off the edge of the seat, standing in the aisle to look up through the front windshield as best he could. Unfortunately, almost everybody else was doing the exact same thing, jockeying and vying for a view at the front, and as such, all he could see was the backs of other kids riding the cheese, as it were. "What's going on?" he asked aloud, hoping somebody would give an answer for the benefit of those who couldn't see. He heard a mixed babble from up closer to the front of the bus, a blended consensus of voices relaying that there was a bunch of cop cars up the street, blocking the way forward. After a couple of minutes, the kids in front of him started flying back toward their seats, and Martin turned and jostled his little brother back into their seat, popping back down himself. A moment later, the driver came back up to the top of the steps, followed by the head of a uniformed police officer in cap and shades. "All right, listen up, everybody," the driver said, hands planted on his hips. "There are some officers here who are going to walk everybody from the next stop to their homes, okay? So the kids on Straub and you two boys who live across the way, come on up here," said the driver. Martin and Jacob grabbed their backpacks, along with the 5 boys and 2 girls who lived down Straub Avenue's stretch, and in a tight line they marched up the aisle to meet the officers who awaited them. As they got onto the street, Martin saw that what had to be just about every North Perry PD patrol car was just ahead, officers directing traffic near the intersection of Lake and Straub. The cop who had come up on the bus himself instructed the Simmons boys to walk immediately ahead of him to the sidewalk, and to keep their attention on their parents just about 50 yards ahead of them down the street. Mom stood there in one of her bright floral sundresses, hands clasped together in front of her mouth, pale as a sheet, while Dad stood with a cigarette in hand, staring off toward the home of Molly and Simon Wilkes. The Wilkes had lived across from the Hollins family in a humble little 1-story rambler, the lawn well kept and with a consistently well-tended flower garden. An older couple, they had always been one of Martin's favorite Halloween targets, because they always gave out full-size bars to the kids who stopped by their house. Despite the officer's instruction to keep his eyes on Mom and Dad, however, Martin found himself taking a peek toward the Wilkes home. A pair of paramedics were, at that moment, wheeling out a stretcher with a dense black body bag strapped to it toward a waiting ambulance. The Wilkeses are dead, he thought, feeling the blood drain out of his face. Moments later, he was wrapped up in his mother's arms, and the remainder of the day, as well as the next few days, passed in a kind of fuzzy blur. "You stick with your friends, and no running off on your own," Mom warned Martin and Jacob, as they made final adjustments to their Halloween costumes. Martin felt a little strange in his own skin, unsure if he should even really be going trick-or-treating. At 11 years of age, he was in the awkward realm of not quite a teenager, but not a little kid, that befuddled kids through all of modern American history. The central focus of most of his waking hours was already a couple of months ahead, because he had managed to sneak a peek in his parents' bedroom closet when they had been locked into watching some kind of politician making a speech on TV the other day, and he had seen the coveted Super Nintendo Entertainment System tucked halfway back on the floor on the right side of the closet. He hadn't seen any game boxes, but for the moment, what specific games Mom and Dad had gotten him and Jacob was irrelevant. The very fact that they had already gotten the brand new game system for them was the key feature here. He could only obsess over what sort of amazement he and Jacob were in for come Christmas morning. "We'll be fine, Mom," Martin said, casually moving his mother's hands away from his gelled hair. He had spent nearly half an hour making sure it was in the proper blocky shape, imitating the iconic look of the villain-turned-hero T-800 from Terminator 2, Judgment Day. Jacob had opted to beg for a Batman costume this year, though the flimsy plastic mask looked about as cheap as it could be, to the older Simmons boy's eyes. "Zoe and Jack Parker are going to be with us, too." As soon as this information was relayed, Martin saw his mother physically relax a little. The Parker twins were known throughout most of North Perry as a well-meaning, if somewhat peculiar pair, doing almost literally everything together. But what most kids around town knew them for most was their connection to the North Perry Police Department. Their father was Sergeant Parker, second in command of the department and a no-nonsense kind of cop. "Well, then, are you meeting up with them at their house?" Dad asked from his usual haunt in his armchair, putting his book aside for a moment to eyeball his boys by the front door. "No, we're all meeting up over at Jeremy Kenner's place first," Martin said, which drew a short, sharp inhale from Mom. The Kenner residence was down in the ring of the cul-de-sac on Straub Avenue. Given the queer events and mystery hanging around the 4 now abandoned houses at the Lake Street end of that avenue, her trepidation was understandable. "I can drive you over if you want," Mom offered, at which Martin rolled his eyes and scoffed. "We'll be fine, Mom. The sun's not even down yet," the boy retorted in a blend of annoyance and understanding. He hoisted his plastic toy shotgun up to rest against his shoulder, empty pillowcase in the other hand. "Can we go?" Mom turned toward Dad, who nodded slowly at her. "Go ahead, honey. And keep a close eye on your brother," she added as Martin and Jacob dashed outside into the brisk Halloween pre-dusk. Martin kept his pace slackened somewhat to keep beside Jacob, for despite his bravado and his impatience for Mom's overbearing worrying, he, too, had come to view Straub Avenue in much the same way as most folks around town had, with a quiet kind of distrust and superstitious dread. He didn't want something happening to his little brother, as a result of whatever weirdness seemed to permeate the entirety of Amelia County, including their hometown of North Perry. It was thanks to this matching of speeds that when Jacob came to an abrupt halt, so too did the older Simmons boy. He felt his pulse beating hard in his throat as he looked over at his little brother, who stood with his own head turned to the right, staring at the former home of the Turner family. It had been nearly 6 months since they had become the latest disappearance whispered about around town, and the house, despite suffering no external damage, seemed to exude an aura of damage and terror from its covered front porch. "Jacob, come on," Martin said, reaching out and touching his brother's shoulder. The younger Simmons boy didn't move, though, still staring as the sky overhead turned a burnt umber shade, the sun on its way toward its own temporary disappearance. "What are you doing?" "There's somebody in there, Marty," Jacob rasped, his voice sounding even more muddled through the narrow mouth slit in his plastic mask. "I saw the curtain move just now. There's somebody in there." Martin felt a band of tension wrap around his guts, moving his eyes from the back of his brother's head to the Turner house. The moment he looked, he saw the curtain in the front window of the house flutter, and his bladder threatened to unleash fury down his pant leg. "There's nobody there, Jake. Now let's go," he said with some force, his voice watery and weak to his own ears. It must have worked well enough, though, as his brother nodded and started moving again down the street toward the rounded end of Straub Avenue. Martin remained rooted in place for a moment, though, as he watched the curtain once more twitch ever so slightly, a pinprick of crimson light glaring balefully out onto the sidewalk at him. Steeling himself, Martin turned his attention away and followed after his little brother. Jeremy raised an eyebrow at Martin a few minutes later as he opened the front door of his house and gave him a thorough once-over, a low, displeased rumble vibrating his throat. "Dude, I thought we talked about this," the slightly taller boy said finally. "I was supposed to be the Terminator, and you were supposed to be RoboCop. It was going to be a whole cyborgs and robots thing. I started making the armor out of packing and cereal boxes with that shiny duct tape, and it just looks stupid," Martin explained. "Besides, copies and doubles are all over the place every year, Jeremy. How many Marty McFlys were there last year, or Ghostbusters the year before?" "Yeah, but our setup was awesome," Jeremy said with a smile. "Of course, it helped with our group having, 4, and Brian being with us. We were the only team around town with an actual black kid playing the black guy from the movie." As Martin and Jacob followed Jeremy into the Kenner home's living room, spotting the Parker twins seated on the couch in Power Rangers costumes, complete with helmets, Martin took a moment to consider their route for this year's trick-or-treating. The Parker twins, being the oldest and ostensibly most responsible kids in the group, would likely be put in charge by Jeremy's mom and dad. As such, Martin made a beeline for the couch. "Hey guys," he said as he stopped a foot away from them, an eerie sensation stealing over him as their heads swiveled almost in unison to look up at him. The dark plastic coverings over their eyes were almost completely opaque, making it difficult to tell that there was actually a human being in each costume. Weird, he thought. Were you thinking of starting us off over at the Tennyson's place and working up to Lake Street? Zoe and Jack looked to each other, with the male of the duo pulling off his Red Ranger helmet and tossing his flaxen bangs out of his eyes. He looked nervous, the bulge of his Adam's apple bobbing up and down as he swallowed hard. Tell you the truth, Marty, we're not really too keen on hitting up anybody here on Straub, the 14-year-old said evenly, eyes darting to his sister for a moment, who silently nodded her support to him. I'm kind of surprised the Kenners haven't hauled stakes and moved. It isn't like they can't afford it. Zoe nudged him in the shoulder, and he made a quick shrug. What? It's true. Would you want to stay living a few doors down from where a bunch of people got offed? Nobody ever said any of them were murdered, Zoe sniped, her voice muffled behind the dense plastic helmet she kept on over her head. They're just missing. Right, because people always just disappear and leave behind all their vehicles and worldly possessions, another kid, passing through the living room nearby the couch, said laconically. I think everybody's here. Can we get going? Marty looked over, recognized this newcomer as Jordan Perch, and rather sullen and unpleasant boy, just 1 year older, and ahead of him in school. If we want to get the best stuff people are holding, we have to be one of the first groups to get to them, especially over on Connolly. Everybody on that street had full-size bars last year. Without much in the way of further argument, all the kids going trick-or-treating for the evening from the Kenner household gathered up their bags or buckets, filing out of the house with farewells to Mr. and Mrs. Kenner, who stood in the archway between their living room and the kitchen, watching the kids go. Dale Kenner had one arm companionably draped around his wife's shoulders, while she clung to him almost painfully, her left hand practically digging into his side, a lone, unseen tear rolling its way down her cheek. The moment Zoe Parker pulled the front door shut behind her, leaving the children safely separated from the adults in the house, Dale let out a low, long sigh. They're gone now, he said, his voice as firm as he could manage, only the barest trace of a terror-born wobble in it, as the scent of cinnamon, barely masking the stench of rotting meat, poured into his nostrils from the kitchen to his and his wife's back. They're safe. For tonight? Surely, said a raspy but cultured voice from behind the Kenners, neither of whom would turn to once more lay eyes on the creature that had been lying in wait for the young trick-or-treaters to depart the home. Eventually, the armor of innocence will no longer protect them, and they will be viable prey as well. Now, if you would kindly look this way. Dale and Cindy turned around, staring at the creature standing opposite them in their humble kitchen-dining room combination. Tall and rangy, the thing looked mostly like a man in a black and white checkerboard suit, a dark pink button shirt on underneath with a black tie, a tie pin holding it in place. The pin was fashioned like a set of 4 hooked blue claws, joined along their rounded tops by a thick black horizontal line. Sprouting from the coat neckline was the feathered head of a raven, though the eyes were bloodshot and far too human, the smile of its beak filled with angled, dagger-like teeth. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, Cindy began muttering, and the bird thing's eyes went half-lidded, its smile sliding away as its beak, somehow almost animated, pooched out into a kind of sidelong smirk, giving him an exasperated expression. Really? Calling upon a faith that you barely even really believe in? You know I can smell your doubt, right? The creature inquired, reaching down to a knee-high cupboard door and yanking it open. Within the cupboard, there were no longer the familiar shelves of canned goods that Cindy and Dale Kenner usually kept stored away there for meals. Instead, there appeared to be a whirling tube of rust-covered metal piping covered in dozens of small, whirling table saw blades, rotating in a slow revolution. All right, then, in you go, the raven thing said, one clawed hand lashing out lightning fast and grasping Cindy by the arm, yanking her forward. With a pivot and a toss, the creature threw her screaming headfirst into the chute of running blades. Her husband followed soon after, fed feet first into the same death trap by the creature. When all was said and done, the raven-headed thing opened the Kenner's fridge, revealing an oversized purple slug of some unknown sort, lifting it up like a lapdog and setting it on the floor near the streaks of blood that had sprayed onto the linoleum flooring near the once cabinet. "Be a good boy, now, and get this cleaned up," it cooed to the creature, which immediately began pressing its ovoid, mouth-like orifice to the floor, suctioning up every last trace of scarlet. "Well, this has been fun," the creature said with a shrug of its suited shoulders, slowly fading out of existence. "But there are other games to play this night." Part 3. For the first year after the vanishing of Dale and Cindy Kenner, the people of North Perry spoke only in hushed tones about Straub Avenue and the creeping shadow that stretched now from the intersection where it met up with Lake Street and the cul-de-sac that terminated the lane. Most of what was said centered around the fate of young Jeremy, who ended up going to live with his aunt and uncle up north in Minnesota, and the rash of seemingly random, wanton assaults that took place on the darkened streets throughout the remainder of that Halloween evening throughout North Perry. For October 31st of 1992, all trick-or-treating activities were cancelled by pronouncement of both the North Perry Police Department and the North Perry Chamber of Commerce. Stores didn't even put out holiday banners or displays around Halloween, and the public schools told their student bodies to refrain from participating in any associated activities. The holiday had officially been cancelled for the year. When the evening passed without incident, the entire township seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The following year, various businesses in and around the town arranged for a modified series of trick-or-treat events, including the owners and operators at the West Ridge Mall on the town's west side. Parents and law enforcement authorities both were encouraged by the idea of having the traditions of the holiday brought back in this limited public fashion, where the kids would be in well-lit public places, thus minimizing the chances for some weirdo to hurt them like they had to dozens of children and adolescents back in '91. Halloween '93 went off seemingly without a hitch, and everybody seemed to relax even further in and around the township, including in the Simmons home. It's always when we relax our guard that the worst of circumstances befall us, as they would learn in early July of 1994. Randy Simmons had considered himself a fairly reasonable man since he had first become a father. He didn't beat his sons when they got fractious or rambunctious, though he wasn't completely averse to swatting either one of them on the backside when they were little and really pushing the limits of what was acceptable. More often than not, though, his solution to their outbursts of bad behavior ran along the lines of taking away privileges and setting for additional demands of chores for several days, through which they would begin at bellyaching and eventually work their way through to firm-jawed, tight-lipped obedience, thanking God when their term of punishment was declared finished. Certain infractions required questions and interrogation, such as the one he presently faced on the morning of July 4th, 1994, holding a red plastic bowl in his left hand, a set of M80 fireworks nestled together within. Jacob and Marty stood in the living room, on the other side of the coffee table from where their father sat. The Simmons family patriarch could tell already which one of his sons was the guilty party here, thanks to the way that Jacob refused to look up and meet his eyes. Marty, though he was only 14 years old, had already started to fill into the athletically built adult that he would eventually become, a build that included a stance that hid no intentionality. There wasn't exactly defiance in his gaze and stance, but more a sort of confidence that he was in the right. I found these tucked in the back of the screwdriver drawer in my toolbox, out in the garage, Randy began. Now, boys, we've talked about this before, haven't we? Yes, Dad, both boys said in unison, though Jacob more muttered than said aloud his part of the harmony. And what did I say the last time we had a discussion about fireworks? You said you didn't want anybody blowing their hands or faces off, Marty said evenly. Randy half expected his older son to now attempt to take ownership of the M80s, though it was clearly Jacob who was the guilty party here. Much to his delighted surprise, though, the younger Simmons boy let out a sigh and took a half step toward the coffee table. I got them off of Benny Cole, Jacob said, shaking his head, still looking down toward the floor. I thought it'd be cool to set them off in one of the empty mailboxes over on Straub. Randy set the bowl down on the coffee table and shook his head. In a strange way, it made a certain macabre sense. Nobody lived on Straub Avenue anymore, after all. The last couple of holdout families had sold off and escaped almost a year ago now, and the houses on the cul-de-sac streets sat vacant, the subject of an ever-increasing number of ghost stories around town. Even thinking on the matter at the moment, prepared to discipline his younger son, Randy thought about the term that he had just used in his own mind. Escaped. What did they escape, he wondered. Oh, you know damn well what, another voice, still his own but much sterner, responded immediately. Nobody will admit it out loud, for fear of ending up with Ravenwood Manor as their mailing address. Randy sat up straighter on the couch, arms folded over his chest. Jacob, you're old enough to know better than to get up to this kind of nonsense, he began. Which also means you're old enough to stay here when your brother, mother, and I go down to Edmonds Park for the fireworks show tonight. Jacob physically slouched at this news, but Randy had already determined that he was going to hold his ground on this punishment, regardless of which of his boys was the guilty party. Now, stay right here, boys. I'm going to go talk to your mother. Let her know what's going on. Randy grabbed the red bowl and headed toward the kitchen, while the Simmons boys remained in the living room. Marty punched Jacob in the arm, though not as hard as he could have. What were you thinking, you dork? He rasped. Ow! I was thinking Dad wasn't going to go looking there. There's nothing around the house he needs to fix right now. You didn't hear him telling Mom he was going to work on the microwave yesterday, Marty said with a sigh, shaking his head. Crap, dude, that sucks. Still, it could have been worse. At least he didn't completely ground you. Jacob nodded. Gives you a chance to play some Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Or Mana, Jacob replied with a nod. Okay, yeah, it could have been worse. I'll give you that one. Mom and Dad returned to the living room then, both repeating the understanding that after dinner, Jacob and Marty would clean up the dinner dishes, and after that, Jacob was expected to remain at home while they took Martin with them over to Edmonds Park for the free concert and fireworks show at sundown. Additionally, until dinner, Jacob was not to go over to any of his friends' houses, but he was free to go outside to ride his bike around the block a few times, or putter around in the backyard, or whatever his idle mind could conjure up to while away a fairly mild summer's day. Marty agreed to go on a ride with his little brother after breakfast, a ride during which they said little, both brothers staring down Straub Avenue a few moments too long for comfort before taking off from the sidewalk stretch fronting their home. When they were around the corner at the first intersection, Jacob offered the lone verbal salvo on his end during that ride. Sometimes I wish we'd moved too, just so I didn't have to look down that street. It creeps me out. You're not alone on that, dude, Marty replied, pedaling along evenly. Part 4. Jacob didn't wait long after seeing the tail of his father's car turn the corner just down the street to head into the kitchen, pour himself a glass of Mountain Dew out of the 2-liter in the fridge, and head out to the living room, changing the television to Channel 3 and turning on the SNES. Mom and Dad preferred to let the boys keep the video game system in one of their rooms, but every now and then they would allow either the old NES or the SNES to be hooked up to the larger television in the living room for brief stretches. It had taken a little wheedling on his part, but he had convinced his parents that being stuck in his bedroom the whole time they were gone would be a complete bummer, and he'd at least be able to answer the phone if he was in the living room while they were out. As such, they'd given the okay for Marty to help him hook the game system up to the living room television before they headed off for the concert and fireworks. The younger of the Simmons boys headed back to the kitchen momentarily, went into the pantry, and grabbed out the bag of Lay's clipped shut there, carrying it jauntily with him back toward the living room and his waiting session of Zombies Ate My Neighbors. When he got to the archway between kitchen and living room, however, he halted all movement, his own sharp intake of breath the only sound he could hear for a moment before the game's intro screen music filtered through his stunned senses. Seated on the couch in his living room, there was presently a strange apparition. A raven-headed man wearing a black and white checkerboard suit with a salmon-button shirt and a dark blue tie. The creature's legs were crossed, and its hands were folded primly on the upper knee, feathered claws and black, its one visible eye all too human, wide and bloodshot. The creature turned its head quickly toward him, its beak splitting open to reveal rows of needle-like teeth fitted together in a psychotic smile. The stench coming off of the creature in his home was a sickly blend of cinnamon and rotted meat. "Happy 4th of July, young Jacob Simmons," the raven thing said in a theatrically jubilant voice, one that struck Jacob as having a touch of a British accent. It thrust itself up off the couch abruptly, a lanky thing indeed, its arms and legs gangly as it towered almost 3 feet over Jacob's humble 4-foot-nothing. The creature narrowed its bloodshot eyes at him, folding its arms over its chest, one curved claw scratching at the underside of its cartoon-like beak as it spoke. "You weren't supposed to be here. Nobody was." Jacob stammered, trying to swallow despite his suddenly desert-dry mouth and throat. I got kind of grounded. My dad found these M80s I got from my friend, mister. The raven thing made a noise low in its throat, nodding. I see. The creature began pacing back and forth from the couch to the television, seeming lost in thought for the moment. "This presents a conundrum for me, young Jacob. You see, I try not to have children as young as yourself brought to harm, not in any permanent way. I may not have much in the way of ethical reservations, but even I draw certain lines for myself. You can ask the folks familiar with my other escapades about that. Then again, you weren't the Simmons boy I encountered in the first draft of this tale, and it wasn't here in your house, so that's a whole other thing to ask Josh about when I have the chance," it said, pausing in its pacing. "What?" "Fourth wall break, nothing to worry about, son," it said with a chuckle. "Dear Sarge or L.B. Weaver or the brothers Crinn could perhaps chime in if you were ever to meet them, eh? What do you think, fellows? Anyhow, this simply won't do," the raven thing said, reaching behind itself and turning back toward Jacob, a large black sack in its clawed hands. "In you go." Before Jacob could compel himself to move, the creature reached out an impossibly long arm, snatching him up by the ankle and lifting him over the opening of the bag, then dropping him into the boundless darkness within. The raven thing hoisted the sack over its shoulder like a perversion of Santa Claus and headed into the Simmons kitchen. When it reached the pantry door, it opened it, stepping through into another house nearby entirely. There, it would wait for its real prey. Part 5. Marty understood very little about the concept of metaphysics, generally speaking. After all, what 14-year-old could be expected to grasp such a bizarre intellectual territory? Certainly none that this storyteller has ever met to please and thank you. One thing he couldn't deny, however, was the growing suspicion, as he and his parents drew ever closer to their home, that something was not right. Almost before his father had even killed the engine, he was out of the back seat and flying into the house, searching for any sign of his brother. The living room was abandoned, the SNES no longer connected to the television. "Marty, what's gotten into you?" his father asked behind him, but Marty ignored him and pelted back down the hallway toward Jacob's room. With the door open just a crack, he could see the room beyond was dimly illuminated by his little brother's television, and when he poked his head in, he saw the huddled form of Jacob in the bed, his back to the door, the television on with Zombies Ate My Neighbors paused mid-game. "Leave him be," Marty's mother whispered over his shoulder, reaching out and pulling Marty gently away from the door. "Besides, it's late, Marty. You should get to bed, too." Marty looked up at her, then back at Jacob silently. Something about the way his brother was laying there didn't seem quite right, though he couldn't quite put his finger on the how of it. Still, he did as his mother bade and shuffled off down the hall to his own bedroom, shutting the door behind himself and getting changed into shorts and an Iowa Hawkeyes t-shirt for bed. In his room, which had been a spare just a few years earlier, before he and Jacob decided they each wanted their own bedroom, Marty lay wide awake, looking at his small television VCR combination unit on his dresser, without actually watching his copy of Terminator 2 for the 1000th time. As the T-1000 antagonist showed up on screen once more, Marty was struck by an odd observation as it morphed its body to appear to be a police officer. If it can happen in a movie, could it happen in real life? Moving as quietly as he could, Marty crept out into the hallway, tiptoeing down to the door at the end of the hall, where his parents' bedroom was, and took a quick peek inside. Both were asleep. Turning direction, Marty headed back up toward the living room, halting at Jacob's doorway, his heart racing as the door silently eased open on its own to reveal the scene within. Standing between Martin Simmons and his brother's bed was what looked like a kind of marionette, draped in ill-fitting clothes from Jacob's dresser. The head was featureless, a simple wooden sphere, and its left arm was raised on a string that ran up toward the ceiling, which had been replaced by a wavering black void, into which Marty could see only perhaps an inch. The oblong wooden finger pointed toward the window of Jacob's room, which opened on the side of the house, and as Marty's eyes slid that way, the window moved up in its frame on its own, opening without a sound. Marty didn't need an engraved invitation, but he wasn't an idiot. Rather than simply dart outside, he went back to his room, put his sneakers on, and grabbed the switchblade that he'd gotten at the start of summer break from Benny Cole. Maybe that kid is a bad influence, he mused, then returned to Jacob's room. The marionette lay inert on the floor now, though its arms still pointed toward the open window, the ceiling of the room once more a mundane bedroom ceiling. As he crossed the room, he caught the faint whiff of cinnamon in the air, and something else, something less pleasant, just under that. Out of the house he clambered, already certain of where to aim himself, as he moved along the side of the house toward the front yard. Standing on the sidewalk fronting the house, he stared down the darkened length of Straub Avenue, eyes fixed on the lone street lamp flickering at the far end of the cul-de-sac. Even from almost 500 yards away, he could just make out something standing against the lamp pole, an indistinct but tall figure, waiting for him. Marty considered grabbing his bike for a moment, but he dismissed the idea almost immediately. He was going to go get his brother back, and if he rode his bike down there, he would have to abandon it in order to carry or guide Jacob back home. With the weapon securely in his pocket, Martin Simmons started to march across the street to the mouth of Straub Avenue, which swallowed him moments later. As he walked right down the middle of the paved avenue, Marty felt the eyes of unnatural things glowering at him from all sides. Staring out of abandoned homes, peeking out from oddly misshapen trees and bushes, that all appeared to have fallen victim to some otherworldly mutation or plague that afflicted plant life. It struck Marty as confusing that neither he nor anyone else in his family had noticed just how other everything on Straub Avenue had become. From the corner of his eye, he spotted what looked like some kind of German shepherd with 6 metallic limbs come clanking its way out from the side of one of the empty houses, a pair of deformed bat wings flapping uselessly from the sides of its head. The peripheral sight of it slowed him in his tracks slightly, but Marty pressed on, slowly but surely able to make out more details of the figure by the flickering lamppost as he drew to within 50 or so feet of it. The creature was a tall, angular thing with a raven's head and feathers, dressed in a black and white checkerboard suit over a salmon-pink shirt with a dark blue tie. No shoes were on its feet, which were talons splayed on the concrete. Its eyes, half-lidded as it looked at him like it was bored, were all too human and bloodshot from what he could see. Beside the creature lay a large black sack, which wriggled and writhed, as if something within struggled to try and escape. Jacob, Marty thought. Just hold on, man, I'm coming. Marty stepped finally into the center of the flickering lamplight, pulling the switchblade out of his pocket and flicking it open at his side, grateful that he hadn't yet lost control of his bladder, though it felt like a near thing. The air had turned weirdly frigid for a summer night, and he could almost see his breath frosting the air as he tried to control his breathing and his heart rate. I want my brother back, he declared in a voice that betrayed his terror, his words coming out in a crackling, pubescent warble. He didn't do anything to deserve whatever's going on here, he said, raising his hands to vaguely indicate all of the cul-de-sac and Straub Avenue along with it. Perhaps he didn't, the raven thing replied in an even tone, pushing off of the lamppost and taking one long, languid step toward Marty, who realized only now that it was moving just how tall the angular creature was. Its eyes flashed wide, as did its beak, revealing a rather nasty set of needle-like teeth and an almost cartoonishly animated smile. Did the Europeans deserve the Black Plague? Opinions vary on the subject, you'll find, young Martin. Furthermore, did the rats deserve the blame? Come on down, my squeaky friends, the raven thing cried out in a voice like a game show host, a slim silver microphone appearing in its left hand. Marty felt the ground rumble under his feet, and as he turned his head to look, he spotted 6 giant black rats, covered in weeping sores and with too many eyes, half the size of a pickup truck each, come thundering out of one of the houses in the cul-de-sac. They halted on the edge of the house's lawn and the pavement, seemingly held back from the center ring the raven thing had made of the cul-de-sac proper, and no sooner did Marty think about it as a center ring than he whipped his head back to look at the raven thing, only to find it now wearing the flamboyant attire of a circus ringmaster, complete with oversized top hat. The microphone had been replaced with a twirling baton as the creature theatrically kicked its feet out in a kind of march dance, the calliope music of the big top filling the air as Marty tried to center himself amidst this oddment. Marty closed his eyes and pressed his hands and fists against his ears. "Please stop it," he rasped through clenched teeth, feeling an unseen pressure squeezing in on the sides of his head that had nothing to do with his own hands. The music disappeared, and as he opened his eyes again, the giant rats were gone, the music had stopped, And the raven thing, still dressed like a ringmaster, now stood a mere 2 feet away from him, hands propped atop his ringmaster's baton like a cane, staring down at him over its enormous beak. I may not have Mr. Jackman's glorious pipes for singing, but I must say, I think I pull off the attire quite well, don't you? The creature asked amiably, reaching one hand up to tug on a lapel. Oh, wait. This is 1994. That movie won't even be coming out for 23 years, so you won't get that. Never mind, it said, snapping its fingers. In the blink of an eye, its outfit changed back to the checkerboard suit with microphone, and it lowered itself to one knee in front of Marty, now looking him almost eye to beak. It held out its free claw toward him. Give me the knife, Marty. You know very well that it's useless against me anyhow, don't you? The boy felt like he was going to throw up all over the creature, the cloying stink of cinnamon and rotten meat wafting off of it powerfully so close up, combined with its just wrongness, carving a path of destruction through his self-control and sanity. Please, Marty managed to croak, looking around the creature to the wriggling bag. He's my little brother. I'm supposed to look out for him. And so you are, young Martin, which is admirable in its own way, the creature remarked conversationally. And part of looking out for him would be not getting into a situation that you can't get yourself out of. Ergo, give it, it said, flexing its claw faintly. Marty let out a sigh and put the switchblade in the raven thing's palm, after which it drew up to its full height. Very good choice. The creature stalked back over to the bag and reached down, with the switchblade, and used it to cut loose the cord that had been tied around the end of the bag. Jacob Simmons came panting out of the bag, covered in sweat, eyes wild as he gibbered and clambered over to Marty's side. Jacob clung to his brother's arm then, staring in abject fear at the monstrosity. Let it never be said that Quoth has no honor, the raven thing said, tossing the switchblade aside with a casual flick of its arm. It then wheeled toward the Simmons brothers and unleashed another of its toothy smiles at them. Now, I've given you what you want, Martin Simmons, yes. But in exchange, you're going to have to give me something that I want. Marty shifted his little brother physically to stand behind him, putting himself between Quoth and the younger Simmons boy. What could you possibly want from me? I'm just a kid. And you're... he began, shaking his head. I don't know what the hell you are. I am what I am, Quoth replied with a chuckle, as a physical incarnation of the beloved Popeye the Sailor character came swaggering over toward him. Quoth, not even deigning to look at the manifested Popeye, pointed his slim silver microphone at it, and for a brief moment the microphone morphed into a large handgun, which the creature used to blow Popeye's head clean off, the animated body flopping to the pavement, its two-dimensional body twitching like a projected animation on the pavement, blood dribbling down the remains of its neck. Marty looked back to Quoth from the dead cartoon icon, the corncob pipe jutting from the corner of his beak. As for what I could want from you, it's a simple thing, really. I need you to carry something for me. Marty quirked an eyebrow at Quoth, who spat out the pipe and started walking past the boys, up Straub Avenue toward the intersecting road on which the Simmons home sat. Follow me, boys. As the three of them stood on the sidewalk fronting the Simmons home, the creature calling itself Quoth snapped its feathered fingers. Marty and Jacob watched in silent awe as pools of shadows gathered from each of the abandoned homes along the dead avenue, slithering like lightning-fast snakes toward them. You will carry Straub Avenue with you, my boy, Quoth said gently, as the gathered darkness slithered into the narrow shadow cast by the older Simmons boy in the July 4th moonlight. Everywhere you go, Straub Avenue will be there. This is the price of your freedom, your safety. The brothers, pushed to the brink of sanity and beyond, collapsed together in front of their home, whisked along by the winged monstrosity that called Amelia County its domain, back into their beds. Neither brother would clearly remember what had happened that night, each of them assuming that they had suffered just another in a long line of nightmares inspired by living in North Perry, Iowa. Perhaps deep down they suspected something more, but for the time being, what harm was there in chalking these oddments up to overactive summer break imaginations? October 15th, 2004. Corporal Simmons swept the room visually over the end of his weapon, giving a thumbs up to inform his commanding officer that they were clear. The sergeant pressed past him, the members of the unit seeming to relax as they spread out in the humble living room of the dwelling. "All right, boys, let's take a minute to catch our breath here," the sergeant said with a heavy sigh. "There's only a couple more places to check out, then we can get the hell out of here and back to the rest of our unit." Marty pulled off his helmet for a moment and armed sweat from his forehead. He had spent the last 2 weeks going through a parade of sweep and secure operations in these little towns and villages throughout Iraq with his unit, constantly living on the knife's edge of mortality. He knew full well what he had signed up for, but he was growing weary. Any man would, living in the shadow of death and adrenaline like this. "There's a solution, you know," a voice whispered in his mind, one he hadn't heard since he was just a boy. "Just step out into the sunlight for a moment, my boy. Step out and share what happened to Straub Avenue." Marty felt a terrible grin spread across his face, and he strapped his helmet back in place, stepping toward the thin wooden door that he had kicked in less than a minute earlier. Behind him, his sergeant barked, "Simmons, what the hell are you doing?" "Don't worry about it, sir," he said over his shoulder, stepping out into the blaring sunlight, watching as his shadow stretched impossibly long up and down the narrow street, civilians running and screaming in all directions from the unknown power being dispensed from Martin Simmons. "It's an Amelia City thing," he rasped, watching giant rats covered in weeping sores tear out of those shadows, followed by a headless Popeye the Sailor Man carrying a gun and a kind of German shepherd running on 6 metallic, robotic legs. Thus concludes What Happened to Straub Avenue, an Amelia City story. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.